Herzlich willkommen, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, zum digitalen UN-Tag hier beim Behörden Spiegel. Ich freue mich, dass Sie heute zu einem so wichtigen Thema eingeschaltet haben. Letztes Jahr feierte die Welt den 75. Geburtstag der Vereinten Nationen und die UN ist die bedeutendste globale und supranationale Organisation, die sich um die wichtigen Menschenfragen unserer Zeit kümmert. Ob nun Krieg oder Frieden, Hunger oder Armut, Bildung und Krankheiten oder das Klima. Die UN trägt zu einem besseren Morgen bei. Kurz nach dem Ende des Zweiten Weltkrieges in Europa wurden die Vereinten Nationen in New York am 26. Juni 1945 gegründet. Die Bundesrepublik Deutschland und die Deutsche Demokratische Republik traten erst später, 1973, bei. Und die Aufgaben der UN, damals die Wahrung des Weltfriedens, die Lösung globaler Probleme und die Förderung der Menschenrechte, sind heute aktueller denn je. In diesem Jahr feiern wir 25 Jahre UN-Standort Bonn. Neben Genf, Den Haag und Wien gehört Bonn seit 1996 zu den wichtigsten UN-Standorten in Europa. Aufgrund der Corona-Pandemie bleibt das Tor des UN-Campus hinter mir leider geschlossen. Um das Jubiläum dennoch feiern zu können, organisiert der Behörden Spiegel zusammen mit seinen Partnern diesen digitalen UN-Tag. Hier auf dem UN-Campus in Bonn finden heute mehr als 20 Organisationen mit 1000 Mitarbeiterinnen und Mitarbeitern ihren Platz. Sie arbeiten täglich in den Bereichen Klimawandel, biologische Artenvielfalt, globale Freiwilligeneinsätze, Berufsbildung sowie nachhaltige Entwicklung. Und zu den größten Organisationen gehören unter anderem das Klimasekretariat und das Hauptquartier der United Nations Volunteers Program, kurz UNVP oder zu Deutsch das Freiwilligenprogramm der UN. Bonn stellt sich dabei auch immer wieder als ein wichtiger Konferenzstandort für verschiedene UN-Treffen unter Beweis, wie zuletzt bei der 23. Weltklimakonferenz, bei der über 20.000 Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer aus über 190 Nationen zu Gast waren. Bonn beheimatet zudem seit 2007 das einzige Vizerektorat der UN-Universität, aber auch kleinere Organisationen wie das Sekretariat des Abkommens zur Erhaltung der europäischen Fledermauspopulation haben in Bonn ein Zuhause gefunden. Die UN-Familie in Bonn wächst also auch nach 25 Jahren weiter. Wir freuen uns, Ihnen heute ein Porträt des UN-Standortes Bonn präsentieren zu können. Und es erwarten Sie interessante Gesprächspartner mit hochkarätigen Gesprächspartnern natürlich, Bilder und Diskussionen zur UN in Bonn und natürlich der Rolle der UN insgesamt. Viel Spaß, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, beim digitalen UN-Tag des Behördenspiegels und damit übergebe ich an die Moderation ins Studio.
Ladies and gentlemen, we meet again in the quest for peace.
There's many who doubted that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, in language and culture.
They even helped to carry the desks in.
We stand today at the threshold of a great event, both in the life of the United Nations and in the life of mankind. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere.
In order to eliminate the threat to the peace in Palestine, an armistice shall be established in all sectors.
An armistice agreement has been entered into between the United Nations Command and the commanders of the communist forces in Korea.
For the first time in the world's history, a permanent international body to deal exclusively with the problems of non-self-governing peoples.
We will be even prouder when we can leave the Congo solely and fully
into good hands of its own people.
Dag Hammarskjöld is dead, but the United Nations lives.
We've
seen a return to democracy in many countries.
I hereby certify that the electoral process in Namibia has been free and fair.
The dawn of a new era.
I therefore have the honor to declare the Republic of Namibia membership in the United Nations.
I think the major contributor to the success of the election of the Haitian people who decided to come out and to vote on the side of their own destiny.
The people of Mozambique who once again proved their commitment to democracy and a strong will to live in peace and harmony.
The Treaty for the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. It is the most important international agreement in the field of disarmament since the nuclear age began.
We should not confuse the signing of agreements with the solving of problems.
Much work remains to be done, but the significant progress represents real successful diplomacy.
United Nations peacekeeping forces received the Nobel Peace Prize for 1988.
Peacekeeping operations symbolizes the world community's will to peace.
The creation of a UN peacekeeping force for Cyprus could only come about by positive action of this Council.
The protection of civilians is at the center of the United Nations peace and security agenda.
The first session of the International Tribunal for serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in the former Yugoslavia.
We have 113 trucks a day. At the same time, it is not like going through Fifth Avenue. We have to negotiate with checkpoints everywhere in order to make sure that we reach the people.
We're starting with no government, no civil services. Nothing remains in Somalia except some spirit and some hope.
I need your assistance so that I will be able to convince the member state to continue to offer the humanitarian assistance.
The right of life, the right to be free from torture and physical maltreatment, a lack of fair trial, limitations on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of movement.
I am here to listen to you. I am here to learn. Tell me, frankly, how you believe the United Nations, myself and my colleagues can be helpful to you.
Minutes ago, an explosion ripped through a hotel in central Baghdad, the headquarters for the UN.
The UN and the international community here have been simply stunned by what's happened. Officials are saying they believe it was a suicide attack.
100 people are wounded and 22 killed.
Today we share our shock and sorrow at the loss of people we loved.
Democracy, which everybody is striving for, is really a rather meaningless phrase if people don't have enough to eat.
The international economic situation has become harsh and unfavorable for all developing countries, especially Africa.
Realizing every person's right to food is a moral and humanitarian imperative. Hunger is a stain on humanity. We are working together as a movement to tackle hunger now and in the future.
The humanitarian case is clear. It will be the world's poorest citizens who will be hardest hit by climate change.
Every week we're seeing evidence that accelerated climate change is here right now. None of this is hysteria, it is fact.
And I'm beginning to wonder how many more alarm bells must go off before the world rises to the challenge. Only courageous leadership will make the goals of Paris a reality.
Behind every refugee, behind every migrant, there is a family, there is skills, knowledge, there is a story, and above all, I would say, incredible resilience.
It is the first intergovernmental meeting in the world where women form part of virtually every delegation.
We want to end gender inequality, and we don't just want to talk about it. We want to try and make sure that it's tangible.
Unless you disperse, it will forever remain.
I shall have to use force.
An indelible blight on human history, that it took as long as it has before all of us stood up to say, enough is enough.
Each lantern represents the hope we have for our future because of the commitments you have made to the global goals.
a renewal of commitment by leader after leader. This is absolutely critical to respond to challenges that affect all countries. We are off track. Let's make it a turning point for people and for planet and deliver a decade of action in achieving the SDGs.
The whole humanity is in this fight together. It is, I think, time for unity.
Today's United Nations does more than ever before. It does it better than ever before. Yet, our work is far from complete. Indeed, it will never be.
Ja, einen schönen guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren, sehr verehrte Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer. Lieber Herr Mohlfenter, herzlich willkommen hier in unserem Studio. Die Anmoderation hat es bereits gebracht. Wir wollen uns heute mit dem UN-Standort Bonn beschäftigen. Anlass ist die 25-jährige Präsenz der UN hier in Bonn, ein Jubiläum. Und das soll entsprechend gewürdigt werden mit unserem Thementag. Meine Damen und Herren, wir, der Behörden Spiegel und die UN zusammen, haben uns ausgedacht, Ihnen einen Überblick über das zu geben, was die UN in Bonn macht. Aber nicht nur, was die UN in Bonn macht, sondern was die UN eigentlich ausmacht. Und dazu haben wir zahlreiche Gesprächspartner gebeten, uns ihre Einschätzungen zu geben. Und wir haben auch eine interessante Diskussionsrunde. Sehr verehrte Damen und Herren, letztes Jahr hat die UN 75 Jahre gefeiert. Sie ist in der Tradition des Völkerbundes entstanden nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg und hat in ihren letzten Jahrzehnten sehr viele Herausforderungen meistern müssen. In dieser Zeit gibt es aber viele Aufgaben, nicht nur die Pandemie, nicht nur die großen Migrationswellen auf der Welt, sondern auch vermehrte Kriege infolge beider Faktoren sind zu erwarten. Und deswegen wollen wir auch mit Fachleuten einen Blick in die Zukunft der UN werfen. Ich begrüße an meiner Seite, ich habe Sie schon namentlich erwähnt, lieber Herr Arne Mohlfenter, begrüße Sie hier in unserem Studio unweit Ihres Arbeitsplatzes auf dem UN-Campus hier in Bonn. Und Sie sind Head of Liaison Office in Germany des UN Regional Information Center for Western Europe. Und Sie arbeiten in Bonn, aber wie der Name Western Europe sagt, auch in Ihrem Brüsseler Headquarter und sind zuständig für alle Kommunikation, die mit der UN hier zu tun hat. Und Sie unterstehen direkt dem UN-Generalsekretär in New York und den wollen wir uns jetzt mal anhören, denn den haben wir gebeten, meine Damen und Herren, anlässlich des 25-jährigen Standortjubiläums haben wir Antonio Guterres, den gerade wiedergewählten UN-Generalsekretär, gebeten, uns ein Grußwort aus New York zu senden. Und das schauen wir uns jetzt einmal an. Also, jetzt kommt der UN-Generalsekretär.
This year marks the 25th anniversary of the United Nations presence in Bonn. I'm delighted to offer my congratulations on this notable milestone. Our work in Bonn is a pillar of a United Nations system that works around the globe to help people and the planet. It is a potent symbol of international cooperation in the heart of Europe. More than 20 different UN entities operate in Bonn, all working together under the common theme of shaping a sustainable future. The United Nations in Bonn is working to build the world we want and need, leading on climate change, combating desertification, and harnessing the skills and passion of thousands of United Nations volunteers. I'm grateful to the German federal government, the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia, and the city of Bonn for their support to the United Nations. And I thank all United Nations staff in Bonn. You are working for a better future for everyone, everywhere. Thank you.
So, Herr Mohlfenter, das war der UN-Generalsekretär aus New York, Ihr oberster Vorgesetzter. Welche Aufgaben hat der Generalsekretär bei der UN?
Der Generalsekretär ist eine der wichtigsten Stimmen in der internationalen Politik. Das ist mit Sicherheit die wichtigste Aufgabe, die er hat. Er macht aufmerksam auf Missstände weltweit, sei es das Thema Syrien, sei es das Thema Klimaschutz, und auch eine ganz wichtige Funktion des Generalsekretärs ist es, dass er die Mitgliedstaaten, die 193 Mitgliedstaaten der Vereinten Nationen untereinander in Kontakt bringt, Dialoge fördert, Anstöße bringt etc. Generalsekretär heißt aber auch, dass er Sekretär ist, und das ist die zweite wichtige Funktion für ihn, dass er nämlich mehr als 150.000 Mitarbeiterinnen und Mitarbeiter weltweit steuert und dieses System der Vereinten Nationen schlussendlich managt.
Herr Mohlfender, also Repräsentant als auch Chef bzw. zuständiger Personal- und Organisationschef, also 2 Aufgaben. Meine Frage ist, zumal der Generalsekretär Guterres gerade wiedergewählt worden ist, stellt sich für vielen die Frage, wie wird man eigentlich gewählt? Gibt es da ein Wahlgremium? Also wie wird man UN-Generalsekretär?
Also der Wahlprozess läuft quasi in 2 Schritten ab. Erstens ist es wichtig, dass man die Stimmen, auch die Stimmen der ständigen Mitglieder des Sicherheitsrates für sich gewinnt. Dann gibt es im Sicherheitsrat mehrere Abstimmungsrunden und dann gibt es weitere Abstimmungen auch in der Generalversammlung. Und dann erfolgt die Wahl des Generalsekretärs. Bisher waren es nur Männer übrigens.
Aha, gut. Danke, Herr Mohlfender. Die UN ist nicht nur für den Standort Bonn, für die Bundes- und UN-Stadt Bonn, so wie sie sich selber gerne nennt, von großer Bedeutung, sondern natürlich als einer der wichtigen UN-Standorte in Europa eigentlich auch ein großes Thema für die Bundespolitik und damit für die Bundesrepublik Deutschland. Und das ist unser Grund, warum wir den Staatsminister im Auswärtigen Amt gebeten haben, eine Einschätzung zu geben, welche Bedeutung hat die UN für Deutschland und auch für die Bundespolitik. Und es spricht jetzt zu uns Staatsminister Annen. Bitte.
Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, 2021 feiert der UN-Campus Bonn sein 25-jähriges Bestehen. Der Grundstein für den Ausbau Bonns als deutsche Stadt der Vereinten Nationen, unsere Stadt für die Vereinten Nationen, wurde am 20. Juni 1996 gelegt. 5 Jahre nach dem Bonn-Berlin-Beschluss des Deutschen Bundestages wurde im Beisein der damaligen Bundesumweltministerin Angela Merkel und des damaligen UN-Generalsekretärs Boutros Boutros-Ghali die Flagge der Vereinten Nationen vor dem Bonner Sitz des Freiwilligen Programms der VN im Haus Kastanien gehisst. Nach dem Umzug von Bundesregierung und Bundestag nach Berlin im Jahre 2006 wurde das ehemalige Bundestagsviertel rund um den Langen Eugen zum neuen Zentrum des UN-Campus. Heute, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ist Bonn mit 24 VN-Einrichtungen und knapp 1000 Bediensteten im VN-System fest etabliert. Markenkern Bonns sind die Themen Nachhaltigkeit, Umwelt und natürlich Klima. Die VN-Einrichtungen helfen Regierungen und Menschen dabei, Wege und Antworten für eine nachhaltige Zukunft zu finden. Die zweite Säule des VN-Standorts Bonn bilden Einrichtungen, die sich mit dem Thema Wissenschaft und Innovation beschäftigen. Die dritte Säule bilden Organisationen rund um die Themen Personalverwaltung und Personalmanagement. Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, dieser Themenmix und die Fördermöglichkeiten der Bundesregierung, dem Land Nordrhein-Westfalen und natürlich der Stadt Bonn entfalten eine starke Anziehungskraft für die Ansiedlung weiterer Einrichtungen der Vereinten Nationen. Im Jahr 2020 konnten wir ein Büro des VN-Instituts für Training und Forschung, eine Außenstelle des VN-Forschungsinstituts für soziale Entwicklung und das VN-Sekretariat für Wasserversorgung als Neuzugänge auf dem UN-Campus Bonn eröffnen. Dieses Jahr, im 25. Jahr seines Bestehens, erwartet der Campus mit dem VN-Exzellenzzentrum für Geodäsie seine 25. VN-Einrichtung. Sichtbarer Höhepunkt des Bonner VN-Jubiläumsjahrs ist die Errichtung des Erweiterungsbaus auf dem Campus mit 330 Arbeitsplätzen auf 17 Etagen, in denen das VN-Klimasekretariat umziehen wird. Damit wächst die Bürokapazität der Liegenschaften am UN-Campus Bonn und bietet Raum für weitere Ansiedlungen. Aber auch, das will ich hier unterstreichen, aber auch als Standort internationale Großkonferenzen spielt Bonn eindeutig in der ersten Liga. Im Jahr 2017 wurde im World Conference Center Bonn die Weltklimakonferenz COP23 mit 23.000 Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmern ausgerichtet. Die größte jemals in Deutschland ausgerichtete Konferenz. Seitdem war die deutsche UN Duty Station Sitzungsort zahlreicher VN-Gremien. Der Auftrag an die Bundesregierung, Bonn als zentralen deutschen VN-Standort auszubauen, koordiniert das Auswärtige Amt. Über ein 1999 in Bonn errichtetes Verbindungsbüro unterstützen wir den VN-Standort finanziell. Wir fördern neue Ansiedlungen und sind auch Ansprechpartner für alle VN-Einrichtungen und internationalen Organisationen in Deutschland, beispielsweise in protokollarischen Fragen. Deutschlands Rolle in den Vereinten Nationen ist in den vergangenen 25 Jahren stetig gewachsen, sei es beim Peacekeeping, bei der humanitären Hilfe oder bei der aktiven Ausgestaltung unserer gerade zu Ende gegangenen zweijährigen Mitgliedschaft im Sicherheitsrat. Diese haben wir genutzt, um zur Beilegung von Konflikten beizutragen, von Libyen über Sudan bis Afghanistan. Wir haben sie zudem genutzt, um auf die Verbesserung der Lage der Zivilbevölkerung hinzuwirken, indem wir uns stark für den humanitären Zugang in Syrien oder für den Schutz von Menschenrechten und den Schutz von Frauen in Konflikten eingesetzt haben. Ein Thema, das uns während der gesamten Mitgliedschaft besonders wichtig war, ist Klima und Sicherheit. Durch unseren Einsatz ist das Thema weit oben auf der Tagesordnung des VN-Sicherheitsrats gelandet, nicht ohne Widerstände. Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, wir feiern heute 25 Jahre VN-Standort Bonn. Wir feiern dabei vor allem seinen Beitrag dazu, dass Deutschland heute mehr denn je als wichtiger und verlässlicher Partner in den Vereinten Nationen wahrgenommen und geschätzt wird. Herzlichen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.
Ja, soweit der Staatsminister Annen aus dem Auswärtigen Amt in Berlin. Sehr verehrte Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, lieber Herr Mohlfenter, der Staatsminister hat über das Verhältnis von UN und Bundesrepublik Deutschland gesprochen. Ich würde sagen, das ist ja vermutlich ein relativ entspanntes, denn die Politik der letzten Jahre und auch die aktuelle Politik der Bundesrepublik setzt auf multilaterale Zusammenarbeit. Das ist einer der Kerngedanken ja auch der UN. Also inhaltlicher Disput dürfte es da eigentlich kaum geben, zumal ist ja die Bundesrepublik auch, sage ich mal, einer der großen Geldgeber, sitzt von Zeit zu Zeit als Mitglied im erweiterten Ständigen Sicherheitsrat, versucht dort auch politische Akzente zu setzen. Wie sehen Sie das Verhältnis Bundesrepublik Deutschland an UN und umgekehrt, welche Bedeutung hat Deutschland für die Vereinten Nationen?
Das Verhältnis zwischen Vereinten Nationen und Deutschland ist absolut hervorragend, das muss man so kurz zusammenfassen. Deutschland ist, das haben Sie ganz richtig gesagt, einer der großen Beitragszahler. Insofern kommt große finanzielle Unterstützung aus Deutschland für das System der Vereinten Nationen. Auch übrigens für freiwillige Aktionen, freiwillige Beiträge werden auch noch gezahlt aus deutschen Kassen. Deutschland hat in den letzten beiden Jahren eine sehr wichtige Rolle im Sicherheitsrat gespielt, als nichtständiges Mitglied. Da gab es wesentliche Initiativen, die von deutscher Seite aus gestartet worden sind. Und dann muss man natürlich auch sehen, dass Deutschland als Standort für die Vereinten Nationen sehr, sehr wichtig geworden ist. Seit vielen Jahren schon. Wir sehen Wachstum, was den Standort betrifft, in Bonn und auch anderswo in Deutschland.
Lieber Herr Mohlfender, nun muss man, glaube ich, der Vollständigkeit halber sagen, Bonn ist ein signifikanter Standort der UN in Europa und natürlich der UN-Standort in Deutschland, wobei es einzelne Organisationen gibt der UN, die auch an anderen Orten in Deutschland sitzen. Ich glaube in München, in Berlin und in Hamburg.
Richtig.
Genau. Aber der Schwerpunkt liegt in Bonn mit zahlreichen Sekretariaten, da kommen wir später noch zu. Nun ist es ja so, die UN hat mit über 1000 Mitarbeitern mittlerweile in Bonn einen Stellenwert erreicht, der signifikant für alle Beteiligten ist. Für das Land, für die Bundesrepublik Deutschland, für das Land NRW, für die Stadt Bonn insbesondere. Daher meine Frage, wie viele Mitarbeiter sind hier, aus wie vielen Nationen kommen die, wie haben die sich hier zurechtgefunden, sind die gern gesehene Gäste, fühlen die sich hier wohl?
Wir haben rund 1000 Mitarbeiter jetzt in Bonn an diesem Standort auf dem UN-Campus. Die kommen aus knapp 100 verschiedenen Staaten, aus allen Kontinenten dieser Welt. Sie sind teilweise schon länger hier. Manche bleiben viele Jahre, sogar Jahrzehnte, andere bleiben eher kürzer, ein paar Jahre nur. Bonn ist fest verankert als UN-Standort in Europa. Ist nicht so groß wie die klassischen europäischen Standorte der UN, Genf, Wien, mit mehreren tausend Mitarbeitern und Mitarbeiterinnen. Aber die Rolle Bonns ist international absolut anerkannt und der Standort Bonn wird auch weiter wachsen und ist extrem beliebt bei allen, die diesen Standort kennenlernen durften.
Ja, das ist interessant zu hören. Eine Frage wird man sich jetzt von Flensburg bis Rosenheim stellen. Warum ausgerechnet Bonn?
Ganz einfache Antwort. Der Regierungsumzug nach Berlin stand an. Die Entscheidung wurde im Wasserberg getroffen. Und dann war es die logische Folge, dass man überlegt, wie können diese ehemaligen Regierungsgebäude sinnvoll genutzt werden. Und da hat Deutschland einen sehr schlauen Schritt getan und sich beworben als künftiger UN-Standort. Es gab früher schon ein kleines Büro des UN-Flüchtlingshilfswerks in Bonn. Der clevere Schritt war, dass man diese Gebäude angeboten hat. Die UN hat dankbar zugeschlagen und das Wachstum begann stetig und es geht aufwärts.
Tja, so ist es gekommen und Sie sagen, es war ein kluger Schachzug und wenn man hier am Rhein entlang geht, dann sieht man ja, was für ein gigantischer UN-Campus da entstanden ist, übrigens exterritoriales Gebiet, also eine Riesenanlage mit vielen Tagungsmöglichkeiten, auch für ganz große internationale Konferenzen und Kongresse. Nun ist das natürlich nicht nur ein Bedeutungszuwachs für die Stadt Bonn, also für die Gemeinde, sondern es ist natürlich auch in gewisser Weise ein kultureller Gewinn, aber eben auch ein materieller Gewinn, denn all diese Menschen leben, arbeiten hier, kaufen hier ein, wohnen hier etc. pp. Und die Bedeutung, meine Damen und Herren, die Bedeutung, die die UN-Stadt Bonn, also der UN-Standort Bonn, für die Stadt Bonn hat, das erzählt uns jetzt die Oberbürgermeisterin der Stadt Bonn, Katja Dörner. Die Oberbürgermeisterin spricht jetzt zu uns.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich freue mich, Sie heute beim virtuellen Tag der Vereinten Nationen des Behörden Spiegels herzlich begrüßen zu können. Bereits seit 1996 feiern wir Bonnerinnen und Bonner den Geburtstag der Vereinten Nationen jedes Jahr im Oktober mit einem bunten Fest auf dem Marktplatz vor dem Alten Rathaus. Leider war das im letzten Jahr wegen des Coronavirus nicht möglich. Umso mehr freue ich mich deshalb über die Initiative des Behördenspiegels zu dieser virtuellen Veranstaltung, die übrigens ganz wunderbar zu unserem Jubiläum 25 Jahre UNO-Stadt Bonn passt. Lassen Sie mich kurz zurückblicken. Der Grundstein für die Entwicklung Bonns zur deutschen Stadt der Vereinten Nationen wurde 1996 mit dem Umzug des Klimasekretariats und des Freiwilligenprogramms der Vereinten Nationen von Genf nach Bonn gelegt. Am 20. Juni 1996, zufällig genau 5 Jahre nach dem Bonn-Berlin-Beschluss, wurde vor dem Haus Kastanien in Plittersdorf in Anwesenheit des damaligen UNO-Generalsekretärs Boutros Ghali feierlich die Flagge der Vereinten Nationen gehisst. Dies war gewissermaßen die Geburtsstunde der UN-Stadt Bonn. Ebenfalls bei diesem Ereignis dabei war die damalige Umweltministerin und heutige Bundeskanzlerin Angela Merkel. In den darauffolgenden Jahren sind die Sekretariate der Vereinten Nationen in Bonn kräftig gewachsen und weitere Organisationen kamen hinzu. Das Haus Kastanien war daher schon bald zu klein. Ein weiterer wichtiger Meilenstein für die Entwicklung der UNO-Stadt Bonn war daher die Übergabe des ehemaligen Abgeordnetenhochhauses Langereugen an die Vereinten Nationen im Jahr 2006, exakt 10 Jahre nach dem Umzug des Klimasekretariates nach Bonn. Auch zu diesem Ereignis reiste der UN-Generalsekretär nach Bonn. Damals war es Kofi Annan. Und wieder war Frau Merkel mit dabei, dieses Mal als Bundeskanzlerin. Heute bildet der Lange Eugen das Herzstück des Bonner UN-Campus, zu dem auch noch das alte Abgeordnetenhochhaus sowie das alte Wasserwerk gehört, das von 1986 bis 1992-93 Sitz des Deutschen Bundestages war. Der UN-Campus ist also ein ganz besonderer Ort deutscher parlamentarischer Geschichte und zugleich ein Symbol für den Wandel unserer Stadt von der Bundeshauptstadt zu einem Zentrum für internationale Zusammenarbeit. Ebenfalls auf dem Gelände des UN-Campus entsteht derzeit ein weiteres Gebäude, das voraussichtlich Ende dieses Jahres bezogen werden soll. Dann werden alle UNO-Einrichtungen in Bonn auf dem UN-Campus versammelt sein. Die beeindruckende Entwicklung der UNO-Stadt Bonn mit heute über 20 Sekretariaten und fast 1000 Mitarbeiterinnen und Mitarbeitern wäre nicht möglich gewesen ohne die große Unterstützung der Bundesregierung und des Landes Nordrhein-Westfalen, für die ich mich an dieser Stelle herzlich bedanken möchte. Heute ist Bonn ein international beachteter Standort der Vereinten Nationen und ein Zentrum für nachhaltige Entwicklung. Internationale Anerkennung erfuhr die Stadt auch als Ausrichtungsort der 23. Weltklimakonferenz der Vereinten Nationen im Jahr 2017. Unter der Präsidentschaft der Republik Fidschi reisten damals mehr als 20.000 Delegierte und Beobachterinnen nach Bonn, um an den Klimaverhandlungen teilzunehmen. Bis heute war dies die größte internationale Konferenz, die in Deutschland stattgefunden hat. Aber Bonn ist nicht nur deutsche Gaststadt für die Vereinten Nationen. Wir sehen uns als Stadt auch selbst in der Verantwortung, gerade wenn es um so bedeutsame Fragen wie den Umwelt- und Klimaschutz, um die nachhaltige Entwicklungsziele und um Frieden und Gerechtigkeit auf unserer Welt geht. Daher ist es uns ein wichtiges Anliegen, die Arbeit der Vereinten Nationen in Bonn zu unterstützen und sichtbar zu machen. Ganz in diesem Sinne möchten wir auch unser Jubiläumsjahr 25 Jahre UNO-Stadt Bonn feiern. Die ganze Bonner internationale Familie ist eingeladen, ihre Veranstaltungen in diesem Jahr unter das Dach dieses Jubiläums zu stellen. Dem Behörden Spiegel möchte ich für die Initiative zu diesem virtuellen VN-Tag ganz herzlich danken. Ebenfalls danken möchte ich allen anderen, die einen Beitrag zum Jubiläumsprogramm leisten, ob virtuell oder real. Wir als Stadt Bonn hoffen darauf, dass wir im Herbst wieder, wie gewohnt, ein buntes Geburtstagsfest für die Vereinten Nationen mit Information, Unterhaltung und Musik ausrichten können. Hierzu lade ich Sie alle schon heute ganz herzlich ein. Hoffentlich ist die Pandemie bis dahin im Griff und ein weiteres Beispiel dafür, was Staaten gemeinsam ganz im Geiste der Vereinten Nationen erreichen können. Bis dahin wünsche ich Ihnen einen informativen virtuellen Tag der Vereinten Nationen. Bleiben Sie gesund. Wir sehen uns im Oktober beim UNO-Tag auf dem Bonner Markt.
Ja, das war die Oberbürgermeisterin der Stadt Bonn und sie erläuterte unter anderem die Bedeutung für den Standort Bonn, für die Stadt Bonn und natürlich auch für die Region. Die Bedeutung der UN hier am Rhein. Vielen Dank, Frau Oberbürgermeisterin, für Ihre Worte. Nun, lieber Herr Mohlfenter, eine so große Organisation, die ihr besonderes Kennzeichen darin hat, dass sie so multinational, also dass diese Gruppe von Menschen, die hier arbeiten für die UN, aus 100 Nationen kommen, das hat natürlich auch Herausforderungen für die Infrastruktur. Man braucht erst einmal Möglichkeiten für die medizinische Versorgung, also fremdsprachige Ärzte. Gut, alle können Englisch, das ist die Geschäftssprache, ist klar, aber man braucht dann auch Kindergärten, man braucht Schulmöglichkeiten und 1000 Mitarbeiter werden auch viele Kinder vermutlich haben. Und diese soziale Infrastruktur, die teilweise ja auch materiellen Charakter, materielle Voraussetzungen hat, ist die gut in Bonn? Hat sich Bonn darauf eingestellt, ein so internationales Publikum hier als Gast zu haben und auch wie alle anderen Bonner Bürger mit allen Leistungen zu versorgen?
Die Kolleginnen und Kollegen, die von anderen Standorten nach Bonn ziehen, sind meistens hell begeistert, was die Infrastruktur betrifft, was auch die Unterstützung betrifft durch die Stadt, durch das Auswärtige Amt, durch andere Stellen. Das ist das eine. Das zweite ist, ja, die Kolleginnen und Kollegen haben manchmal besondere Bedürfnisse. Das liegt daran, dass sie zum Beispiel von Nairobi nach Bonn wechseln müssen. Dann müssen sie die Kinder in eine internationale Schule schicken. Die gibt es in Bonn zum Glück. Das wird auch rege genutzt von uns. Es gibt Kindergärtenplätze direkt neben dem UN-Campus. Also diese ganze Infrastruktur ist aus unserer Sicht sehr, sehr gut. Was die Verankerung in der Stadt betrifft, viele wollen gar nicht mehr weg vom Standort Bonn, weil es so beliebt ist, weil die Lebensbedingungen extrem besser sind als an anderen harten UN-Standorten. Und insofern werden viele von unseren Kolleginnen und Kollegen auch wirklich heimisch hier. Sie engagieren sich in schulischen Aktivitäten, in Sportvereinen sind viele tätig. Das zeigt sich auch daran, dass viele die rheinische Lebensweise wirklich übernehmen. Es gibt jetzt seit ein paar Jahren eine eigene UN-Karnevalsgruppe, die UN-Funken, die auch beim Bonner Umzug jedes Jahr mit dabei sind. Wir wählen auch eine Prinzessin und sind auch, also was heimische Lebensbräuche betrifft, extrem aktiv.
Also, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, Sie sehen, wie absorbierend so eine rheinische Kultur sein kann, dass es bei der UN einen eigenen Karnevalsverein gibt, die UN-Funken, die sich auch am Brauchtum hier beteiligen. Aber nun wollen wir ein bisschen ernster wieder werden. Jetzt kommen wir zu den Aufgaben der Mitarbeiter, der Sekretariate, die hier in Bonn sind. Und da haben wir unter anderem das Freiwilligenprogramm der Vereinten Nationen, kurz UNV, das bereits seit 1996 seinen Hauptsitz hier hat und seit 2007 seinen Sitz im ehemaligen Bundestagsgebäude. Sie sprachen darüber, dass diese Gebäude sozusagen die Einbringung der Bundesrepublik Deutschland für den Standort UN in Bonn waren. Und die Aufgaben nun dieses Freiwilligenprogramms, eines der ältesten, das in Bonn angesiedelt wurde, das erläutert in einem Interview der Executive Coordinator of United Nations Volunteers, Toili Kurbanov, mit unserer Kollegin Frau Dr. Proll im Interview.
Ja, vielen Dank an die Moderation im Studio, und bei mir ist jetzt Mr. Toili Kurbanov und wird mir ein paar Fragen zum Thema Freiwilligenprogramm der UN und natürlich auch UN-Standort Bonn mitteilen. And because Mr. Kurbanov is comes from Russia, I will switch into English. And Mr. Kurbanov, you're very welcome to me, and thank you very much for your time. Nice to meet you. Before I have the first question for you, let me just say a few words to you. You took up your appointment as the Executive Coordinator of the United Nations Volunteers short UNV program on the 4th of January in 21, and with over 25 years of leadership experience at the international and national level, you until now have been the Deputy Executive Coordinator of the UN Volunteers, where you have played an important role in positioning UNVP in the context of Agenda 2030 and UN reform. So nice to meet you, and thank you very much to be with us.
Thank you very much. And although you had suggested that we switch to English, I might add that I was really impressed with your spotless accent when you were pronouncing my name. It was spotless Muscovite accent.
Okay, I didn't prepare for that.
I don't.
But let's start. Let's start with the first question. The founding was initiated, or the founding of the UNV was initiated by the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and in his speech 1968 at the Harvard University, he said, "Creating an international legion for the purpose of gaining victory in the fight against the real enemies of humanity, that is against poverty, hunger, and social injustice in any form." What is the current situation in this fight?
Well, you've come really prepared to this discussion. Indeed, the Shah of Iran was one of the initiators of the establishment of UNV. But as the saying often goes in English language, success has many parents, failure is always an orphan. So when it comes to UNV, there are many individuals who claim to have been parents. The Shah of Iran is one of them. The establishment of the Peace Corps a few years before UNV, and the role that President Kennedy had played back then, was also quite instrumental in building the momentum for the global voluntarism. President Nixon, in fact, who was coming from another party, was also promoting this idea through the State Department with the United Nations, as did Foreign Minister Gromyko of my own country, So it's one of those initiatives where different factors, different influences have come together. And I'd like to acknowledge the role that was played back then by the Secretary General of the United Nations, U Thant, who happens to come from Myanmar, or Burma as it was known back then. We know a country with a difficult history, which is going through difficult times right now. So we are in spirit and in our thoughts with our colleagues and the people of Myanmar. But the Secretary General U Thant had arguably played the most crucial role in establishing the UNV. As we know, the world has changed since then, irrecognizably. I don't want to repeat the cliches, but just to add to the context, when UNV was created, this is late 60s, early 70s that we're talking about. One of the biggest global tragedies was the war in Vietnam. Here in Europe, there were the student protests all across the European university campuses. My part of the world was different, living in a completely different system. And last but not least, that was the world that was not quite yet out of the colonial era. The post-colonialism had only started in the 1970s. So UNV back then was created in a completely different context. But the fact that it was relying, and the theory behind the creation of UNV was leaning on fundamental human values, the spirit of solidarity, compassion, helping each other, regardless of where we come from, our backgrounds, the age groups, our gender, is probably the most important reason that although the systems have changed, the world has changed, the history has changed, but UNV remains as relevant as ever, as will be always these notions of compassion and solidarity.
Mm-hmm. How do you work fighting against poverty, hunger, and injustice, or to reduce it by now?
Well, the UN volunteers are playing an important role, working with the rest of the UN system to contribute to addressing these challenges that you have listed. We have to recognize, though, and this is a development practitioner speaking in me, that hunger, poverty, injustice are often not the development problems themselves, but they're the symptoms of the larger problems. The fact that we have weak institutions of governance still in many countries, that many countries are suffering from inequality, that is polarizing the societies. Many countries are coming out of war. Many countries are still operating in the humanitarian context with millions of people who are displaced from their shelters. And on top of that, the increasing every year hazards of the climate-induced disasters. These are the root causes of today's development challenges. And I'm proud to say that as I speak, more than 6,000 UN volunteers around the globe are contributing to addressing both the symptoms and strengthening the core governance institutions in more than 150 countries around the world. They're doing it not by themselves, and UNV is not the singular actor, but we deploy UN volunteers, people who are truly global citizens, who are devoted, who are passionate and skilled to support the work of the UN agencies on the ground, whether it's WHO, the World Health Organization, which of course is playing a pivotal role right now in the context of the COVID response, whether it's UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, and that is working closely with many countries to develop democratic governance institutions, whether it's UNICEF, the United Nations Children Fund, whether it's UNFPA, whether it's the peacekeeping operations and the special political missions. Many of them, more than 60 United Nations agencies, funds, and programs and departments are relying on the work for UN volunteers in a big extent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You named already a lot of UN institutions or other institutions. Where to find you or the UNV in the UN structure or family, and what is your status?
Well, the United Nations Volunteers, or UNV, is a system-wide service platform to the United Nations. We're the service providers, in other words, to all parts of the United Nations system. United Nations system, as your audience might know, is comprised of three main pillars: peace and security, development, and human rights. So it happens, following from my previous discussion, that the UN volunteers are engaged in all of these pillars work, which is why we are the system-wide service provider. We are administered by UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. So on a daily basis, we coordinate our actions with UNDP at the country level. So we're a semi-autonomous entity within the United Nations system that is providing services across the entire spectrum of our operations.
Mm-hmm. What is the daily business of your organization? Could you describe or name perhaps an example?
Well, never day is alike. No day is the same as the day before. We never have a dull day. But fundamentally, our role is to increase and to contribute to the recognition of the spirit of the volunteerism in the United Nations. Because that in itself not only does allow to bring in devoted global citizens, but also because the virtue of the work, by virtue of the work of the UN volunteers, makes the work of UN agencies at the country level more connected to the communities. Often, when you have a UNDP or UNICEF country office in a country X, let's say Myanmar, which I had mentioned before, or any other, they have established headquarters in the capital, and then they work closely with different government counterparts, with the civil society, with the private sector. And when they do that work, when it comes to the interface with the communities, it is often the UN volunteers who are at the front lines, as we say. So our job every day is to create more opportunities for the UN volunteers under the auspices of different agencies, funds, and programs of the United Nations system to contribute to the well-being of various societies. So we work with UN agencies to explore where could be additional opportunities to mobilize UN volunteers. We work with them to understand and anticipate the future needs because it's never a static environment. You know, in the country X, we were working on the UN was working, for example, on the poverty reduction program in the year 2019. And then in 2020, everything got redirected towards COVID response. So some developments we cannot fully anticipate. And yet we're doing our best to be able to see the future demands of the United Nations system. And then in parallel to that, to seek out, to reach out to the international community rather, through our social media, through the internet, through our country offices in many countries, to increase the awareness of these opportunities, to establish a talent pool, as it were, of potential UN volunteers who could be deployed for these purposes. That's in a nutshell the description of our daily job responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And where do your volunteers come from, and how does the UNV recruit its volunteers?
You know, when we were talking earlier about the history, I mentioned that this was in the post-colonial era when UNV was established. Back then, the recruitment of volunteers, or by the recruitment of volunteers, what was important or what was considered essential was to identify talent in the global north, in the more developed countries, and then to send them to the global south, to the developing countries. Now the world is no longer the same, and therefore the volunteers are coming not only from the global north, that's the definition that we often use in the multilateral institutions, but from the global north and the global south. As of today, more than 70% of the UN volunteers are coming from Africa, from the developing nations of Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. And almost 30% are coming from Northern America, Western Europe, Central Europe, Japan, and Korea. And we have, as a matter of fact, the number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 nationalities of the UN volunteers today are all from developing countries. It's Cameroon, Colombia, India, Kenya, and Bangladesh. And then, of course, we have the Germans, we have the French, the Japanese, the Americans, and so many other. Overall, 179 nationalities are represented in the global UN volunteers workforce. We recruit them through our country offices in many developing countries, and we rely a lot these days on the digital tools. We recruit them through the social media, through our global web-based talent pool, and we do so. When we do so, we're also trying to reach out to different demographics. not only to the young people, but to the people of all age groups, because there's interest in volunteering in all of societies, regardless of the background and the age group.
Mm-hmm. How does modern development or foreign aid look like?
Yeah, modern development aid is obsolete. That definition. Modern development cooperation is what matters a lot more. By aid, which was the predominant modality in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and arguably in the 90s even, what we meant by aid was somewhat patronizing approach when there are developed countries and underdeveloped countries, and then the former are aiding the latter. Well, that's no longer a valid definition of how we operate, and no longer the valid definition of our real political and socio-economic context. We've seen the rise of the many developing countries. Of course, we often hear about the large emerging nations, such as China, Brazil, Turkey, who are no longer just the recipients of the foreign assistance, but also the providers of the foreign assistance. But even beyond that group, there are many nations that have established strong capacities. Still, in all countries, we're struggling with inequality, without exception. In all countries, we're facing that the institutions of governance can be improved, can become more inclusive. But by and large, this all means that what describes today's engagement is development cooperation. So we're hearing less and less of foreign aid, and those who are speaking about foreign aid, they will eventually have to adopt. It's a different ballgame. It's a different type of engagement when we all have to be respectful rather of the needs and of the voices of the local communities, not only the governments, but also the civil society, and of course the private sector, without whose contribution the development cooperation won't be effective. So what matters today is development cooperation, and that's sort of equal to equal relationship between the various member states, the various countries. But then also within each country is not only the government-led processes or the government-owned, which is important, but also the processes of development cooperation that are inclusive, that are relying and bringing the best out of the civil society and of the business, of the small and medium enterprises, and also the larger corporations.
Mm-hmm. So when it's not aid but cooperation, what needs to be done by the industrialized countries then?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm appearing a little bit like a nerd here, coming back to all these definitions. But again, the notion of industrialized are less relevant now than they used to be when UNDP was created. In fact, many of the societies or the economies that we used to refer to as industrialized, they're post-industrial now, all right? And many of them who are agriculture-based or rural economy-based, they are the new industrialized, often with a strong manufacturing type of, even the notion of developed versus developing. I wonder we will be still speaking with these terms 10 years from now, But if I understood your question correct, you're talking about countries such as Germany and your peers in the European Union. I think maintaining the spirit of solidarity is still important, not only between the individuals, but between the countries. Seeking as much as possible multilateral solutions, although the bilateral solutions, of course, are also very valid and still have an important niche. Arguably, multilateral solutions bring broader ownership and therefore could lead to the more long-lasting impact. So the maintaining of the solidarity and emphasizing investing in the multilateral solutions, the multilateral system, is what we hope the countries such as Germany and your neighbors in the European Union will continue to show strong commitment, which they've done in the past. We're still seeing it continuing going forward. And of course, on top of that, what we need today is, sorry for switching to this trivial language, we need role models. We need countries that I say not only do that like I say, but do like I do. You cannot claim or demand other countries that they should address the inequality when we have polarizing inequality in many post-industrial societies. When we have big burden, big pressures on the middle class in many of the industrial societies. So it would be good to demonstrate through the policies and the commitment how these more developed countries are addressing their internal issues of equality, fairness, justice, strong institutions, lasting commitment to the democratic institutions. That would be, in my view, far more important than providing daily assistance to any other country. So I would sum up, continue with the spirit of solidarity and compassion. No country should feel they're on their own, and no country on their own can address these problems, which leads to the second, support and investing in the multilateral solutions. And the third, lead by example.
Mm-hmm. And concerning another level, what can each individual do?
You asking all these tough questions. I think it's really each individual's choice. It's based on their each individual reflections. I wouldn't want to even begin to pretend that I can prescribe any recommendations for every individual. We all find different ways of contributing to the well-being of our immediate communities, our towns, our cities, our countries. It depends on the individual, and if an individual has an ambition and spirit to contribute to the global level as well, then sign up as UN volunteers.
All right. How does Corona influence the work of the UNV?
Yeah, we've had two distinct phases in the Corona response, and we seem to be now entering the third one. The first, the immediate onslaught, as it were, of the Corona, the first few weeks, where our main responsibility had to be, and the main impact had to be, was on the well-being of the UN volunteers. As I said, there's any given day, there's more than 6,000 of them. Over a year, it would be close to 10,000. They're all in different countries, often lacking the health facilities that we wish we would have access to. So providing duty of care for the UN volunteers was the number one and the most important task. And we were relying a lot for these purposes on the cooperation from the hosting UN agencies, from the WHO offices, UNDP, from the UN special political missions and the rest. And of course, then there were issues we had hundreds of people who got stuck in transit, or could not, were recruited to start working in Congo, and then they could not assume their duties. So then we had to create conditions for them to start remotely to facilitate their transit. But luckily, we have such a strong and talented and devoted team here in Bonn and across the globe that are working to facilitate the work of UN volunteers, that we were able to address these issues with the support of UN agencies. But then quickly, we moved on to the second phase, which we're still right now in, which is the phase where we needed to respond to the demand of the UN system for additional talent to be deployed immediately to support the country's efforts to address the COVID hazard. Many UN agencies were involved in the immediate support to maintain or to expand the capacity of the health facilities so that they're not totally overwhelmed. Many had to work at the front lines at the community level to increase their awareness of the COVID impact. And especially these days where there are all sorts of conspiracy theories, believe me, it was not an easy job to work with the communities to try to undo some of those fake news and some of those biases, and to encourage them to follow the practices that have been recommended by WHO and by the governments. We've been also working to help the UN to partner with the governments to assess the impact on their economies, and therefore to be able to readdress or redirect their domestic public finance. And there were many other dimensions of the COVID where the UN system as a whole was very active supporting the countries, and therefore we needed to respond to their needs, such as one that is still very important, and that the Secretary General spoke often about. In fact, he said just 2 days ago that COVID had a human face, and that was a female face. The fact that in the context of COVID, in many countries, we've seen the increase of the incidence of the gender-based violence. So UN Women, UNICEF, UNFPA, UNDP, again, were the front lines of this response to help set the hotlines, to provide psychological counseling support. So in this second phase that is still continuing, we're trying to mobilize more UN volunteers to support the UN on the ground. But it is, of course, much easier said than done any day, especially during the COVID when you cannot travel. So we have to redirect our efforts and to emphasize access to the national, locally available talent pools. So most of the volunteers deployed to support the UN in the last few years were the national volunteers, because only then could start their jobs. You cannot recruit from Germany, send them to Kenya anymore. So we really had to change the way we're accessing local talent and bringing them on board as UN volunteers. It's mostly national volunteers right now, the community volunteers. But on top of that, there's still need for international expertise. So we've been working with the UN how we can create opportunities for the remote digital volunteering. And I would like at this point to acknowledge the partnership with the government of Germany, with whom 15 years ago we've set up online volunteering platform that was used to render these services remotely. And we had revamped it in the last year, and we had processed thousands of online volunteering assignments. Anybody now sitting behind their desk in Bonn or in Moscow or in Washington, D.C. can dedicate a few hours a day to work with the UN on the location-neutral tasks. And in the digital era, the list of location-neutral tasks is growing by month. It could be the database management, data processing, infographics when it comes to the community awareness, translation in different vernacular languages. So that was the second, the most significant, the most challenging phase of the COVID response. And right now, as we speak, we're entering to the third one, which is the vaccination in many countries, where, again, the UN agencies are working closely with the governments to facilitate the speedy vaccination as much as possible. Vaccines are still not available in every country. We still need to show global solidarity by making vaccines available in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, Latin America, and in the Middle East. And when it comes to those countries where the vaccines are already available, it is much easier said than done to roll out the vaccination campaigns. So again, UN is there to support the countries, and UN volunteers are there with the rest of the UN to get these vaccination programs rolled out as smoothly as possible.
The ongoing digitization you already described may also be one of the impacts Corona has on the recruitment of volunteers, but it may not be the biggest impact. Perhaps can you name other impacts on the recruitment of volunteers due to Corona?
Yeah, digitalization, but the second, as I said, is switching to the national recruitments. Before 2020, the majority of the volunteers globally were international volunteers, not only from the global south going to the global north, but often from one developing country to another developing country, from India to Algeria, for example. This is almost on hold for the last 12 months. We still have a few instances when those volunteers are able to travel. But the recruitment, the main impact was switching to the national recruitments, creating the national talent pools, reaching out to the local professional associations, whether it's the nurses or the engineers, or seeking talent nationally for data analysts, which is increasingly demanding skill set in the UN system. The major impact was switch to the national recruitments and then digital recruitments for any internationally available expertise.
Mm-hmm. Let's come to another point, to the point of Bonn, where we are all together today by now. You have only recently become executive coordinator at the UNV, as I said before, and you've been to Myanmar, Fiji, and New York, among other places. Now you're based here in Bonn. How does Bonn stand out from the rest?
Now I can speak of that because although I was based in Bonn notionally for the last 4 years, in reality, before the COVID had started, I was living off the airplanes, mostly traveling around the world, staying in touch in building these local partnerships with the UN agencies, funds and programs, governments, and the civil society. In reality, I only spent last year and 1 or 2 months in Bonn. Bonn is, of course, no city is comparable to another. I would never imagine to compare even New York with Fiji or with Yangon. Bonn is, in Bonn we are fortunate to have very conducive environment to the work of the UN agencies based here. We have access to the deep labor pool for any of the emerging needs in the UN system on the long-term and the short-term basis. So that from the work perspective, what I found quite attractive in Bonn is good living conditions and, of course, access to the labor pool. When it comes to the international travel as well, although our own Cologne-Bonn airport is not the one with the globally most diverse network of the flights, but we still have access to Frankfurt, to Düsseldorf, and Amsterdam and Brussels are next door, literally. So it's also a strategic location that will continue to enable the work of the global organizations based in Bonn because it allows access to different corners of the globe.
Okay, I mean, at the moment you don't fly that much from Cologne, Bonn, so but I understand the critique at the airport. Yeah. Okay. Bonn is as well home to many NGOs, especially in the development aid, or as you said, in the development cooperation. What does cooperation with the NGOs look like?
We, I'll be honest, we are mostly working with the local civil society organizations when we work with them. Because they're based in the countries, they are often playing a critical role in the human rights protection, also in the civil service provision, in the community cohesion, and many others critical areas of the development work. We see the value of being co-located with other international organizations, including our own siblings in the UN system, primarily in the knowledge sharing. But in terms of the operational interaction, it is mostly happening in the field. Of course, those global organizations that are based in Bonn and elsewhere that have their local chapters, we're in close contact with them as well. One of them would be, for example, VSO, the Volunteer Service Organization based in the UK, or Save the Children or Oxfam. Here in Bonn, we're mostly collaborating through knowledge sharing. It also has to do with the fact that even within the United Nations system, and I spoke earlier that we have 3 pillars. The other way of division of labor in the UN is that we have more operational parts of the UN, and then more normative. Those who are based in Bonn, the larger ones are the secretariats of various global environmental conventions. So because of that, they are mostly normative in their work. They convene global consultations, they support implementation of the global agreements such as the Paris Accord and the rest. We, because of the nature of our work, are mostly interacting with the operational agencies. Those whose acronyms often popped up in our discussion: UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, WHO, World Food Program, WFP, UNHCR, and they're located all over the world. Many of them are based in New York, others in Geneva.
Mm-hmm. One last question, Mr. Kobanov, because you said before to me, you are also the coordinating or the chief of the UN campus in Bonn. How do you see the future of the UN at all, and in particular with respect to the city of Bonn?
As an international civil servant, I defer to the vision of the government of Germany. The vision of the future of Bonn will come is coming from the government of Germany at all levels. Federal, the state level, and of course the city level. And we're in close contact. We know that these issues are being discussed, considered. We're looking into the future of the UN in Bonn. Also in conjunction with what we had mentioned earlier, Eva, the fact that we are at the 25th milestone, 25 years milestone, being based in Bonn. Every anniversary is an opportunity for us to look back and also to look forward, which is why we're having these discussions right now. So how do we want, where does the government and the government and the people of Germany want to see Bonn 25 years from now? So I would defer to those discussions and the bigger considerations. I mean, the vision would come from there. When we look at today's reality, Bonn, the UN Bonn campus had expanded in the last 25 years. It was never static. We're proud to be hosting more than 20 UN entities today in Bonn. We wish that growth in the number of the entities would also grow in the number of the UN staff. That would also give a critical mass that would be necessary to position Bonn as Germany's United Nations city. As it stands today, Bonn is probably number 7 and number 8 in terms of the concentration of UN agencies in Europe. Globally, of course, New York is number 1. We have large presences in Nairobi, Bangkok, which are the Asian and the African hubs of the UN, which are also very, very large and much larger than many European presences. In Europe, number 1 is Geneva, 2 is Vienna, 3 is Rome, with food-based UN agencies. 4, I believe, is 4 is Paris because of the UNESCO, and then comes Copenhagen, and then comes Budapest, and then probably comes Bonn. So there is room for growth, but it would depend on the vision of the government and the collective dedication of all the parties. I had self-nominated myself, self-appointed, as the goodwill ambassador of Bonn in the UN system. So whenever I speak to my UN colleagues, I always stand for, and I mean when I promote the virtues of being based in Bonn. But going forward, it will require a lot of a dedicated effort, and not just looking at the campus facilities, but the overall environment around the campus as well. Like making the public services available in English language, adding to the quality of the international connections, because this COVID era will end sooner or later. All of these big issues are to be considered when we look into the future, hopefully brighter future of the UN Bonn.
Then we hope a lot of growth for the UN city in Bonn, and thank you very much for you as a representative of Bonn, and thank you for your time for the interview. It was very informative, and now I hand over back to the studio, to the moderator. Thank you very much, Mr. Kobanov.
Thank you for thanking me for doing my job.
Bye.
Bye.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, das war das Interview mit dem Chef des Freiwilligenprogramms der Vereinten Nationen, Herrn Kobanov. Ich hatte es vorhin schon erwähnt, es ist eine der ältesten Organisationen hier am Standort Bonn, aber nicht die größte.
Nicht die größte ist das Klimasekretariat, wahrscheinlich auch das weltweit bekannteste.
In Zeiten von Climate Change ist das vermutlich so, zumal auch das UN-Klimasekretariat der Austrager der internationalen Klimakonferenzen, wovon ja auch eine in Bonn stattgefunden hat, beziehungsweise eine Vorbereitungskonferenz. Und die nächste, das wissen Sie alle, meine Damen und Herren, die nächste globale Klimakonferenz findet in Glasgow im November diesen Jahres statt. Und mein Kollege Bennett Clavon sprach mit der Executive Secretary des Klimasekretariats, mit Patricia Espinosa.
Good afternoon, Ms. Espinosa. I'd like to welcome you to the Digital UN Day of the Behörden Spiegel. From 2006 to 2012, you were Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, and since 2012, you were Ambassador of Mexico to Germany. 2016, you were appointed as the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or short UNFCCC. The UNFCCC has been in Bonn since 1969. You are based in Bonn since 2016. Would you call the city your home?
Yes, of course. We all here at the Secretariat, we call Bonn our home. In fact, many of the colleagues here in the Secretariat have been living in Bonn for over 20 years because we have actually a group of staff that really has remained in the organization for a long time. So yes, we do like to call Bonn our home.
Thank you. How would you describe the work of the UNFCCC? What exactly are your tasks for our viewers?
Well, we are a secretariat that has been established by the Framework Convention on Climate Change that you mentioned at the beginning. And that convention is really the legal instrument that provides the big framework for the world to work together to combat climate change. So what does the Secretariat do? The Secretariat then is making sure that the countries all around the world, because we have 196 parties to the convention, every country is really fulfilling its obligations under the convention. More recently, in 2015, the international community, the Conference of the Parties, approved the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement, what it did compared to the convention was to define very specific goals and obligations for each of those 196 countries. So we now also have the task of following up on those commitments. And in the last 5 years, we have been working on the operating guidelines for implementing those commitments, for fully implementing the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. What has the Secretary achieved since its foundation? Can you walk us through the history?
Well, actually, if you think that 25 years ago, when the convention was approved at the Rio summit, at the conference of the Earth in Rio de Janeiro, at that time, the approval of this convention was really a remarkable achievement. Why? Because people were not so clear about what is climate change. What does it mean? It is, even today, when we talk about climate change, sometimes it's difficult to explain what it is, right? When we talk about the warming of the temperature in the atmosphere, it's very difficult to understand. However, nowadays, when you talk about the extreme weather events, the changing weather, the droughts, the floods, the hurricanes, typhoons, these snowstorms that we have seen in so many places in the world just in the last few months. Even here in Bonn, over the weekend, you know, all these storms and the changing weather in 1 hour, different kinds of weather, that becomes much clearer to the individuals, to the citizens. So what have we achieved over these 25 years? First, we have achieved a cooperation framework that intends to bring all the efforts of all the countries together to address a global challenge. And this challenge is really the most important existential threat to humanity over the long run. So this is why it is so important to understand that only with a cooperation with every country in the world, and that involves, by the way, not only the governments, it also involves, businesses, cities, civil organizations, and individuals. Only in that way will we be able to address a global threat that recognizes no borders and that does not stop in spite of any other important and pressing situations that are happening, like the pandemic right now.
Thank you. What is the current situation in the fight against the climate change?
Even if we have made a lot of progress, as I have mentioned, even if the framework for cooperation has really been developed and awareness has been raised and commitments have been made, the truth is that we are still very, very far from where we need to go. The science has told us that by the end of the century, we should not go beyond warming in the atmosphere of 1.5 degrees. According to the commitments that countries have made so far, we are on track to double it. And that, according to the science, means that we are looking at a very catastrophic world, a world where people will be suffering, where the effects of climate change will increase the problems of poverty, will increase health problems, will increase economic problems. So this is why it is so important that we act right now. That we, this year, when we are going to go to the COP26 in Glasgow, we take very important and really change decisions that will change the course of how we have been making business until now.
Thank you. What are the potential impacts of failing to meet the climate targets? Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. I mentioned some of them in my previous response, but maybe let me start by saying that we already know that with the way that climate change has affected already our planet, it is we have suffered already some damages that are going to be irreversible. And that relates to, for example, biodiversity. So some species are extinct and we will not be able to recover them. So what are we looking at if we go on this way? Precisely that. We are looking at more damages to our ecosystem. I would say very dramatic situation has to do with the coral reefs all around the world. We all love corals, not only because they are beautiful, but they are also, a source of life in the ocean. So imagine if we lose the corals. We will be losing the corals, but also a lot of species that can only survive because of the corals. What else what other example can we use to explain this? If we continue to have these extreme weather situations, there is likely to be drought in many places of the world. That means that people, and this is already happening in some places in the world, people will be literally starving. They will have no way to get food. So people start going elsewhere. Displacement takes place. Sometimes displacement takes place within the countries, and that creates a difficult situation because that those people that are moving towards other places need to settle down, need to also have their needs fulfilled. But even in some cases, these people go to other countries. And here in Europe, we have seen this migration coming from some countries in Africa and other countries that is happening. And we are seeing clearly that in many cases, it's really people that are desperate because they are starving. They don't have a way to make a living in their own countries. So this is the kind of situations that can happen. I always say that climate change is a multiplier of threats. So any threat, any challenge that we are facing, if it is health, if it is also poverty, if it is nutrition, all of those challenges are exacerbated by the effects of climate change.
Thank you. What needs to happen to avoid these consequences? Can you tell us?
Well, we need, first of all, we need countries to really fulfill the commitments that they have made. In many cases, we have these really very ambitious goals. And I think that the Convention and the Paris Agreement, especially both of them, provide a very clear pathway on how we can build a better future, how we can build a greener future, a healthier future, a prosperous future for everyone. The point is that the plans by themselves do not transform into reality. So we need everybody involved in making those plans become a reality. And that includes, of course, the main actors are the national governments. But it goes beyond that. It really goes beyond the national governments. The national governments need to enact, of course, policies and legal frameworks and many decisions that provide the good framework so that this transformation can happen. But then individual businesses need also to put into their core decisions the aspect of sustainability and climate risks. The investors need to do the same. At the end, it's about really going towards a future where all of us take conscious decisions that really bring at the center the question of sustainability. So that is what needs to happen.
The climate change doesn't care about borders or something like that. Where do we need more cooperation? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, you're absolutely right. Because climate change doesn't recognize any borders, climate change doesn't recognize whether you are rich or poor, or you have one religion or the other, or, doesn't distinguish between political preferences or anything. The only way to address it is through cooperation. And this is why multilateralism and all these multilateral instruments are so important. And why would each and every country in the world commit to this kind of cooperation? Not in order to help the others, but because it is in its own main interest. We really need to underline this, because sometimes when we speak about cooperation, people think that we're talking about helping somebody else. We have to cooperate to help somebody else. In this case, no, it's cooperation in order to be able to address our own very important challenges. So we need cooperation in terms of finance. We need cooperation in the area of technology and innovation. We need cooperation on capacity building. We need also cooperation in the exchange of experiences between governments, cities, businesses. We realizing that it is a challenge that is affecting each and every one of us needs to be translated into cooperation at all levels all the time.
Thank you. We are experiencing a worldwide pandemic. The cooperation failed in the pandemic between states so far. Is the corona pandemic a setback for the efforts or an opportunity?
Well, I think it's a bit of those. It depends on which angle you look at, right? On the one side, for example, we had, according to the Paris Agreement, we had the deadline of December 2020 for the presentation of new and updated nationally determined contributions, which are the national climate change plans. And we got 75 of those plans, 75 countries. So that means that more than half of the parties to the convention and the Paris Agreement did not comply with the deadline. Some of them, maybe many of them, we could say, were delayed in their processes, partly because of the pandemic. We know that in many countries, really activities were, in all countries, activities were disrupted, and sometimes the work of the people that were working and elaborating those plans may have been affected. So that, we could say, was a very negative effect of the pandemic. At the same time, I think that the pandemic also gives a huge opportunity. And the opportunity to really deal with the two crises together is quite unique. Because for overcoming the crisis that has been developing as a consequence of the pandemic, countries are taking extraordinary measures. Countries are assigning resources that we could not have foreseen before. Now, how can we take that as an opportunity? We need to make sure that those resources that are invested in recovering from COVID are aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement. That whatever infrastructure, for example, that is included in those recovery plans, it is made with a clear assessment of the need to make it resilient, the need to take into account climate risks. And if we are going to invest in, for example, in energy, that we invest in renewable sources of energy, that we invest in clean technologies, that we invest in companies that have put very clear goals for themselves in order to lower their emissions, become more sustainable.
Thank you. You mentioned the Paris Agreement. Last year marked the 5th anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement. In the meantime, the US exited and re-entered the agreement. What is your assessment of the Paris Climate Agreement?
Yeah, the Paris Agreement is really one of the most outstanding instruments that multilateral diplomacy has achieved. I like to underline that for me, the Paris Agreement is a covenant of hope with the people of the world. The Paris Agreement really must be seen as one of the biggest achievements multilaterally. Also, a big achievement was the fact that in spite of being a very, very complex agreement that really affects basically all of societies, it entered into force in less than 1 year. That's very unique. I do not recall other international instrument that has has entered into force in such a short time. So the Paris Agreement is very strong. It is really enjoys an incredible amount of support. Yes, it is true that we had the previous U.S. government decided to depart from the Paris Agreement, and that made many people think that maybe many countries would follow that decision by the U.S. And what we saw was that nobody else followed that decision. And actually, we kept on seeing accessions to the Paris Agreement. I think that that means that it's a very clear signal that sustainability and addressing this big challenge of climate change is at the center of the agendas everywhere in the world.
In 2017, the COP23, the climate conference, was also held in Bonn. It was one of the bigger conferences in Bonn in the near past. How did the city handle it? What is your assessment?
Yes,
well, it was a wonderful experience, I have to say. I was already here as the head of the organization, and so I had the privilege of making part of the whole process, since it was decided that the host or the president would be one of the island states for the first time. And at the same time recognizing that the Fiji did not have the possibility of holding such a big conference in their country, and therefore that it should take place here in Bonn, where the venue of the Secretariat is. And it was just amazing, the support that we got from the local authorities, from the federal authorities, from the federal government as well. And it was just an incredible success. I have to say I was a bit worried that it could become very disruptive for the city, and suddenly having here more than 20,000 people attending a conference could become a challenge, but it was just everything worked in the most amazing way. So everybody was very, very happy, very satisfied. And I think that this big event really contributed to showing how much of a good host the city of Bonn and the government of Germany are.
This is nice to hear. One further question to the COP23. Were you able to continue the initiated process of the Paris Climate Agreement?
Yes, of course, we have been trying to first, finalize all the guidelines in order to implement the Paris Agreement, but also follow on the different commitments that have been made. I mentioned before, for example, the commitment to mobilize $100 billion to support developing countries in their efforts to address climate change, but also commitments regarding reductions of emissions, and the putting in place of national plans everywhere in the world, in all regions. So yes, we continue to make progress. Of course, last year and this year have been challenging because of the COVID pandemic. So a lot of the work that we are doing right now is virtual. Basically, all of our work is virtual. Like right now, we are having this virtual interview. But that has not stopped us. And the reason is that, you know, the COVID, the climate emergency has not changed, has not stopped because of COVID, and therefore our work cannot stop either. We need to go on.
Thank you. This year, the COP 26 will be in Glasgow. What are your expectations and hopes for the conference?
Well, it's a very important conference. I would say that this COP26 is the most important conference since the Paris Agreement was adopted. It is really the moment where we need to finalize all the negotiations related to the guidelines for implementation of the Paris Agreement, and in this way really have all the instruments for a full implementation of commitments under the Paris Agreement. And for that, this year we need to see that the promises that have been made before are kept. They relate, of course, to mitigation actions, reduction of emissions, but they also relate with supporting resilience building and adaptation, and supporting financially the efforts of developing countries. So that's something that needs to be done, besides finalizing the negotiations. We also need to have a clear indication through the nationally determined contributions, through the national climate plans, that we are getting closer towards closer to being on the pathway towards 1.5 degrees. And finally, we really need to have there a very inclusive conference, and a conference where we have the voices of civil society, of businesses, of academia. Everybody needs to be there, and we should not leave anybody out of the conversation or any solution out also of our consideration.
Thank you. One last question. If we had one wish for the federal government of Germany or and the city of Bonn, what would you wish for?
Well, I have to say my deep gratitude to the city of Bonn, to the citizens of Bonn also that are just fantastic hosts, and also to the government of Germany. Our kind call would be, please continue to support us, continue to support this amazing organization. I'm really very proud of being the head of this organization with an amazing group of professionals and people dedicated that believe in what they are doing. And please do it, because it is really for the benefit of the future of humankind. It is a very important task.
Thank you, Ms. Espinosa. Thank you for your time. Und damit gehe ich zurück ins Studio.
So, meine Damen und Herren, das war das Interview mit Frau Espinosa. Und lieber Herr Mohlfender, es ist die größte Organisation oder das größte Sekretariat. Das sind die Organisationseinheiten, die selbstständig die verschiedenen Themen bearbeiten bei der UN. Wie viele Sekretariate gibt es in Bonn?
Momentan sind wir bei 25 angelangt, Tendenz leicht wachsend.
Aha. Und wer legt fest, welches Sekretariat nach Bonn, nach Wien, nach Genf, nach New York oder nach Nairobi kommt?
Naja, manchmal guckt man, wer bietet die besten Bedingungen. wer bietet angemessene Büroräume, Infrastruktur etc. Bonn hat bei allen Bewerbungen sehr, sehr gute Karten. Manchmal klappt das, manchmal geht es an andere Standorte. Das ist ein internationaler Wettbewerb um UN-Organisationen und damit auch Arbeitsplätze.
Nun ist ja das Klimasekretariat in diesen Zeiten sicherlich, wenn die Pandemie sich gelegt hat, ja, ist Klima sicherlich wieder ein Top-Thema, jetzt auch, aber danach wahrscheinlich noch mehr. Und wir wissen alle, dass da auch sehr viel getan werden muss. Deswegen ist das Klimasekretariat natürlich im Fokus der Öffentlichkeit weltweit. Und alle, die hier schon mal vorbeigegangen sind in den letzten Wochen und Monaten am UN-Campus, haben gesehen, da wird ein neues Hochhaus gebaut.
So ist es. Der Lange Eugen kriegt Zuwachs, der Campus wird größer. Es gibt ein neues Hochhaus, in das auch Kolleginnen und Kollegen des Klimasekretariats einziehen werden, mit anderen, aus anderen Büros und Sekretariaten. Das Gebäude entspricht modernsten Standards, ist absolut energieeffizient und es ist wirklich ein großes Schmuckstück dieses UN-Campus geworden. Wir hoffen, dass wir das in den nächsten Monaten dann offiziell eröffnen können.
Sehr gut. Meine Damen und Herren, an der einen oder anderen Stelle ist klar geworden, besonders mit den beiden Beispielen der Sekretariate, nämlich des Freiwilligenprogramms und des Klimasekretariats, ist klar geworden, die UN hat Aufgaben, die weit in die Zukunft, für die Zukunftsgestaltung entscheidend sind. Damit stehen wir am Ende unseres Thementages, am Ende unseres heutigen Programms, meine Damen und Herren. Und es bleibt mir nun eigentlich, und das ist eine Sache, die mir sehr am Herzen liegt, lieber Herr Mohlfender, also eine kleine Organisation wie der Behörden Spiegel trifft auf eine globale Organisation mit zigtausenden von Mitarbeitern in ganz vielen Ländern, mit komplexen Strukturen bis hin zum Sicherheitsrat, der über Krieg und Frieden entscheidet. Und dennoch haben wir die Zusammenarbeit gut gemeistert. Und das muss man dazu sagen, meine Damen und Herren, das unter Pandemiebedingungen, was nicht einfach ist. Denn wir, sowohl Sie als auch ich, wir waren nicht immer in unseren Büros. Wir mussten Wege und Mittel finden, unsere Interviewpartner zu finden. Ist uns alles gemeinsam gelungen. Dafür von meiner Seite aus ganz herzlichen Dank, Herr Mohlfender. Und dadurch kann ich mir erlauben, Ihnen ein Geschenk zu machen. Sie haben das letzte Wort.
Vielen Dank, Herr Proll. Es war pandemiebedingt eine Zusammenarbeit, manchmal zwischen mehreren Ländern, zwischen New York, Bonn und auch anderen. Uns hat es großen Spaß gemacht, dass wir diese Zusammenarbeit mit Ihnen machen konnten und hoffentlich hat das dazu geführt, dass der UN-Standort Bonn weiter bekannt wird.
Herr Mohlfender, ganz herzlichen Dank und sehr verehrte Damen und Herren, bis auf ein weiteres Mal, danke für Ihr Interesse. Auf Wiedersehen.